Blog Talk Radio.
All right, you ready?
Hello. Hello. Tonight on Bigfoots Pad Paranormal Radio, we have Ken Gerhard to talk about Thunderbirds, which is a subject that he has co-written a book about, to my, at least to my knowledge, and we're going to interview him like we do with all our other guests. And tonight is probably going to be a night full of great insight and information, like we always have when we are able to talk to various experts in various fields of the paranormal.
And yeah, Ken, just to start off the show, I was going to see if you could talk a little bit about your background and some of the things that you've done that have gotten you interested in Thunderbirds.
Well, welcome. Thanks for welcoming me on, guys. I really appreciate it. It's great to be here. It's an honor to be on your show. I just want to start off like that. As far as how I got into cryptozoology, of course, everyone wants to know that because it is kind of an unconventional lifestyle. For me, it started as a young boy. Growing up in the late 70s, there were a lot of shows on TV like In Search of with Leonard Nimoy and Rod Serling, and different people were doing these monster specials about Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, and I just became very fascinated. And then when I was around that same age, I saw the Minnesota Iceman exhibit up at the Minnesota State Fair, and of course, at that age, I didn't know if it was real or not, but it was, it was just really fascinating to me that the possibility was out there that there were these man-like creatures running around. So it just became a life passion for me. And growing up, my mother was very supportive of my interest, and she was a travel agent, so she was able to arrange some really cool trips for me all over the world, and including Loch Ness. And it's just something I've stuck with my whole life. And as I've gotten older, I've it's such fascinating subject matter, and you meet so many interesting people and hear all these amazing experiences. So it's really a passion.
Well, I was just wondering, so do you mainly study just all cryptozoology, or do you specifically do like one or two things in particular?
I've investigated a diverse number of different cryptids. I guess my primary area of research would be the big birds. I did, as you mentioned, write a book about that, particularly focusing on reports and sightings down here in Texas where I live. I've, of course, done research on the Texas version of the Chupacabra, and I've done Bigfoot research throughout the United States, though mostly here in the southeastern United States and Texas, Louisiana, and Florida, and so forth. And I also did a werewolf investigation recently for the History Channel, if anyone saw The Real Wolfman. So I try to stay diverse. Obviously, there's a lot of different reports that come in all the time from different people, and I know there's a number of excellent researchers already in the Bigfoot field. A number of them that I correspond with, and I think a lot of people are very interested in that. But I think some of these other weird creatures sort of get neglected from time to time.
Well, I know that we actually go out and look for all sorts of things just like that, and right now we have some people actually that are asking me to start asking some questions on the Thunderbirds. So right now I have these broken down into different categories. I have Thunderbirds, I have big oversized non-reptile birds or flying creatures, and then I also have reptile-like. Like I have non-reptiles and reptile-like basically, and ancient Indian.
Mm-hmm.
Something that I would like to start with is, can you talk a little bit about what the legend of the Thunderbird is and some of the Indian tribes and things like that mention them?
Well, yeah, of course. Thunderbird, of course, is a generalized term which has been adapted throughout American culture, but it originated with many different Native American tribes from all over North America, from the Pacific Northwest and Alaska, down through the deserts of the Southwest, the Southeast, and even in New England. So there are many different tribes that had these legends of these enormous birds that were so enormous that they would block out the sun. And the name Thunderbird refers to their affiliation with thunder and rainstorms. And part of the legend states that Thunderbirds, that the beating of their wings was so loud that it sounded like thunder. But a more scientific or pragmatic theory is that these animals were taking advantage of the great air currents, that were associated with these storms, and that they were able to fly on these currents because they were so massive. But anyways, that's one of the things that's really cool, is that there's a cross-cultural belief. There's so many different Native American tribes that have stories and legends about these great birds that could pick up warriors or sometimes whales even. And of course, the fascinating part is that we have reports of these Thunderbird-type things in modern times, and we still continue to collect these on a consistent basis. So people are still describing something up there that's much larger than anything that's known to science.
Well, so the Thunderbirds, for instance, so it's basically what they are is they're, to clarify for people that are asking me, so they're basically like gigantic. Would you say that they're like eagle-like or like reptile-like, or they don't really say, or?
Well, that's one of the real mysteries behind the Thunderbirds, the modern Thunderbird reports, is that we have a vast variation in descriptions from different eyewitnesses. I think the most common are probably the very large raptor type of birds, and by raptors, of course, we mean vulture, eagle, any of the really large predatory types of birds. And people have reported seeing these birds, with wingspans anywhere from 15 to 25 feet across, which is about 5 times larger than any vulture or eagle that's known to exist. The other types of reports that we collect are not as common, but people have reported something that looks very similar to a prehistoric reptile, such as a pterosaur or a pterodactyl. And of course, these were not dinosaurs, but they were a specialized species of flying reptile that evolved millions of years ago, were really dominant in the Triassic and throughout the Jurassic, and eventually died out, I believe, at the beginning of the Cretaceous. But people have specifically described Thunderbirds that have leathery skin, no feathers, sometimes the head crests that we associate with pterodactyls, a long reptilian tail, and of course bat-like wings.
Well, say, well, scientists have found animals that have been thought to have been extinct for millions of years, within the past 100 to 200 years in nature, especially in the deep ocean and in very remote parts of the world. So do you think there's actually a very plausible possibility that there could be some remnant of a living dinosaur or something that could be contributing to these Thunderbird legends, Mr. Gerhard?
Well, anything's possible, and that's my overall view as a cryptozoologist, is I really try to stay open-minded about all the possibilities. Now, scientifically speaking, the real chance of a pterosaur surviving beyond the extinction of 64 million years ago that science kind of holds to be the best theory is unlikely. However, there are reports throughout North America from time to time, but more commonly we hear of these pterosaur-type reports coming from some of the old world jungle places. For example, we have the rope end of New Guinea, I believe, which was featured on an episode of Monster Quest. There's also the Kangamato of Africa, and these are both described as being essentially or looking like pterodactyl-type creatures. And these are in areas that are very remote, unexplored, and are in much warmer or equatorial climates, so they haven't been impacted, by all the climate changes, that have occurred over millions of years.
Wow. Yeah. Well,
I think it's possible. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, you just brought up an interesting point. Actually, you were talking about the rope in New Guinea. The team, we've actually been thinking about maybe in a year or two going out to Gorka, New Guinea, and maybe doing our first international expedition. Have you, or do you know anybody who's ever been up there before that's done such an expedition?
Absolutely. I've corresponded with several researchers, including Garth Guessman, Jonathan Whitcomb, but mainly Paul Nation, who lives here in Texas. And Paul is probably the most experienced rope-in explorer. He's been over to New Guinea and islands off New Guinea, I believe, at least 4 different times. He spent at least 16 continuous weeks in the field. And Paul has really gone through some treacherous expeditions out there. I believe on his first trip he caught malaria. He's gotten gravely ill several times out there, and we have to keep in mind, certainly want to encourage you guys to go out there. I would go in a heartbeat, but you know, those are the types of problems that arise with exploring an area like New Guinea. You know, you're at a very remote area. There's all kinds of things that can give you diseases and really mess you up. And, you know, of course, you're traveling through some pretty treacherous terrain, and it's no man's land. So, I mean, there are some real challenges that go along with exploring an area like that. But then again, those are the areas that have the best possibilities for really holding something that's unknown to science.
Hey, Ken, I just had a quick question really quick. We have a bunch of people that are saying that your name's pronounced a bunch of different ways. How do you pronounce your last name? Sorry about that.
No problem. It's Gerhard.
Oh, it's Gerhard?
Yes, sir.
And also, speaking of the rope, and I was just wondering, so are the reptile-like creatures, are they mainly spotted on little islands, the ones around, like, the rope-in, for instance, or, like, are they mostly spotted in locations like that?
Initially, the rope-in reports that were collected were coming off an isle called Rambutio, and there's also an island called Umboy, and those are both off the eastern coast of Papua New Guinea, both rather small islands. However, there have been other reports that have surfaced from the mainland of New Guinea and in the interior, where you have some really dense jungles and volcanic mountain ranges. In fact, I believe about a couple of years ago, there was one area near there where several new species of animals were discovered within, you know, a couple of weeks when some scientists were out there doing an expedition. So the area is definitely rich with possibilities.
Well, one thing I would like to ask was, because we were thinking of going to Umboy Island, actually, which is ironic you just mentioned that. I know some knowledge on the topic, but not a lot on the rope-in. So would you recommend going to Umboy Island, or would you stay on, like, the mainland?
Well, I mean, of course, on the mainland you have a lot more territory to cover, and it's probably going to be more difficult to get in there. There are, as I mentioned, there are several experienced rope-in investigators. Bill Gibbons, who I believe lives in Canada now, he's a Scottish cryptozoologist and really an adventurer. He was really the first person to bring a lot of these reports back from New Guinea, back at the beginning of 2000, I believe. But I would definitely, you know, correspond with some of these other researchers that have gone out there, because there's new reports surfacing all the time. And what's interesting is that a lot of these rope-in researchers are actually missionaries, and that's how they first heard about these stories, that they were doing mission work out there in these remote areas, medical missions and building wells and so forth. And that's how they began to get to know the local people and hear about these stories and reports of these rope-in creatures. So, you know, there's a lot of information coming out of there all the time. I'm privy to some of it, but of course I've got so much going on. But I would really do my research and find out, you know, maybe where the most recent sightings are. But you know, it seems like Umboy and Rambutio, you know, have both had a lot of reports surfaced from those two particular islands. So that might be a good place to start as well.
Well, another thing is, speaking of us going on the trip and, like, just looking for the rope-in in general, do you know which side of the island, like the mainland, it's generally spotted on? Or is it in the center?
Well, that I don't remember specifically, except that there are a lot of reports that come off, you know, the coast of the islands, and of course, you know, fishing and so forth is one of the main activities of the people that live there. And a lot of these reports come from fishermen and people that are on the coastal areas that you know, are out there fishing at night and so forth. But in terms of the Kongamado of Africa, it's interesting that the name Kongamado has to do with the overturner of boats. And that's kind of the translation from the local tongue. And the legend there is that the Kongamados would swoop down from the sky and attack these fishermen in an attempt to get the fish that the fishermen had in the boat, and oftentimes overturn the boat. So there could be a correlation there. We do believe that pterodactyls and were primarily, either scavengers or perhaps lived in coastal areas and fed on fish. So it would be a fair presumption that, if this is a real animal, that it would be near water. And again, mountain ranges are going to be very difficult, as far as logistics and traveling and so forth. So that's something to keep in mind.
So, is a lot of the rope-ins, are they supposed to be nocturnal, or are they just daytime creatures?
Well, there have been some daytime sightings. In fact, there was one very famous sighting where an entire village apparently saw two of the animals flying out to sea from a mountaintop. But most of the recent sightings that I'm aware of, or reports, are of the nighttime creatures. And one of the interesting attributes that's connected to the rope end is that it's alleged that it emits this weird glow at night, sort of like a firefly, which doesn't really mesh with what we know about pterosaurs or really any living creatures that are, advanced beyond insects, phosphorescent or bioluminescent or whatever you want to call it. But, that's been the latest craze in rope-in research, is these researchers claiming that they see these lights flying around in the sky at night, and that they've been analyzed by different experts who claim that they could in fact be living creatures of some kind and not, mechanically, like a plane or whatever.
Yeah.
So well, they got the fish, I know, down in the deep ocean that are bioluminescent and, like you said, insects. So it's definitely a phenomenon within nature, but it's not something that can be easily detected.
Forgot about those fish.
Do you know of any evidence, like if there's any footprints or any kind of sound recordings or anything of just the reptile-like creatures?
No sound recordings that I'm aware of. And as far as footprints, some vague references in a couple of cases, but nothing that's been cast or photographed or anything like that. Now, as far as Big Bird down here in South Texas, one of the very first reports happened in 1976 when these two teenage girls claimed that this man-sized, scary-looking bird was, lurking at them in their backyard one day. And when their parents went out to investigate, they found very large tracks that, bird-like tracks that were about 6 inches long and an inch deep in the ground. And one of the local news crews came out to actually film the tracks and run a story on the report. Unfortunately, because the story was filmed in 1976, there weren't a lot of VCRs at that time. And I've checked with that television station, and because it was pre-digital, they never archived that footage. So it may be lost forever if it actually exists.
So is the creatures that are seen in Texas and the U.S., are those ones, are they mainly reptile-like, or would you just refer to them as oversized regular type birds, or I don't know how you would say that, known birds?
Well, the reptile type is kind of what got me into the research in the first place, because the very first report I ever received was from a gentleman in Houston when I was living in Houston that had seen a pterodactyl type thing flying, or pterosaur, I should say, type thing flying over his home when he was younger. When I collected that report, I found that there were other reports very similar to his in description from other parts of Texas. One of the most famous big bird reports happened in February of 1976 when 3 school teachers here on the south side of San Antonio, where I live, were driving to school one morning, and they claimed that these 2 enormous airplane-sized pterodactyl type things were flying overhead, and they actually stopped, pulled over their cars to watch them. When they got to school later that day, they looked through some encyclopedias and science books, and they were all in agreement that what they saw was in fact a pterodactyl, that's exactly what it looked like. And there's also a famous case of an ambulance driver down at Los Fresnos that saw a pterosaur type thing fly across the road in front of him. Other than those 3, there's a few other vague reports, but generally speaking, most people in Texas have described very large black vulture or eagle types of birds, but with a deep wingspan.
Mr. Gerhard, I was just wondering, are you familiar with the case of Arturo Padilla of San Benito, Texas in 1976?
Arturo Padilla. Well, I should know this, but there's so many names and so many reports from that time. I believe he
Two
may
police
have
officers?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, this was a report of 2 police officers that were driving through, I believe, Harlingen, when they claimed that this giant white bird flew over their patrol car. This was before the sun had come up. And this was one of the very first reports also that came in on Big Bird. I think it was around Christmas time in 1975. But local wildlife officials quickly dismissed it as being a giant pelican, which is, never been proven. And from what I understand and what I remember researching the book, the officers actually just went along with it and didn't really question the explanation too much. But the thing that they saw was as big as their patrol car. And although pelicans get quite large, I think they can get a wingspan up to about 7 feet across, they're not terribly common down in South Texas. There are some there, typically the brown pelicans. But, yeah, that was a very good question.
Well, so is the bird in Texas just called Big Bird? Is that what people refer to it as?
Well, Big Bird is a name that the media came up with, and it is, in fact, a play off the Sesame Street character, which was very popular back in 1976 when the report surfaced. So it's not actually a very technical way to put it. We could be just as easily call them Thunderbirds. Big Birds is just sort of the localized name for these creatures. But we have to remember that a lot of these monsters that we look for, so-called monsters, have gotten these colorful names through the media. Bigfoot, for example, was a name that may have been whispered locally, but it wasn't a native name. Obviously, it was kind of a localized name until the news kind of picked up on it and broadcast the story. Same with the Loch Ness Monster, Nessie. You have the Abominable Snowman, which is really a media term for the Yeti. And, of course, with Bigfoot, we have the technical name, which is Sasquatch. So a lot of these names, Big Bird, Bigfoot, it's just kind of a media hype thing. Even the Chupacabra to some extent. They're names that grab people's attention and really our imagination. So it sells newspapers.
Well, another thing was, speaking of these giant birds, one of the people in our chat rooms was wondering, how big are they generally, like on average, like just both of them, like the reptiles and the condor-like birds?
As far as the pterosaurs, the ranges have been from about 7-foot wingspan to about 30, I believe, 25 to 30 feet, which is well in the range of pterodactyls. Of course, we had a species that was discovered here in Texas known as Quetzalcoatlus. We found its fossils in West Texas back in 72, and it had a 40-foot wingspan. What's interesting on the smaller pterosaurs that are reported here in South Texas, people typically also report that they have this long reptilian tail with a diamond or flange shape on the end. And that coincides exactly with a specific type of pterosaur known as the rhamphorhynchoids, which actually had a tail that looked exactly like that. As far as the big birds, I think the wingspan ranges have been from about 12 foot to 25 feet across is what's been reported. Now, we have to keep in mind, and this was pointed out on the episode of Monster Quest that I did, people's perception of things flying in the air is not always, really accurate. I mean, it's very hard to judge distance and scale on something without being able to relate it to an object on the ground and so forth. So some of these estimations may not be totally accurate. But I think the big picture here is that people are definitely seeing something that's not normal. I mean, we all see vultures and eagles and owls on a semi-regular basis, and we're familiar with how big they get. But when you see something that's 5 times that big, which is a really dramatic difference, then we definitely are talking about something that is unique and unusual.
So, for the Thunderbirds in general, how far back do these legends go?
Oh, well, wow. I mean, you have legends around the world, and of course the Thunderbirds and the Big Bird reports it's a global phenomenon. You have the Rock, R-O-C, which was back in East Africa in ancient Arabia, there were these legends of this bird that could basically pick up an elephant and fly away. That was the rock. You have other very large bird-type creatures. Oh gosh, there's one in India, and it's just on the tip of my brain, and I can't think of what it's called, but I'll try to come back to that one. But yeah, you definitely have these very old references and very old texts that are hundreds of years old of these giant bird-like creatures. And then in the 19th century, there was a famous case in Switzerland where a young girl was picked up by a large eagle type of bird and carried off, to her death, and the villagers eventually found her body in the side of a mountain, miles and miles away. So it's a phenomenon that's been going on for centuries.
Yeah, Ken, we have a question in our chat room. They're asking, have you sighted one of these, Thunderbird?
No, I definitely have not. I never have. I have seen one time when I was in Houston, I just happened to be looking up in the sky, which understandably I do quite a bit now. Way up in the air, I saw a very large bird that had, at first what I thought was a long reptilian tail, so it looked very reptilian in shape, but it was very, very high up in the air, and it seemed pretty good size from where I was at. When I went in and did some research later on the internet and different places, I really feel now that what I was looking at was some type of stork or heron or a bird that has very long legs, and that those legs, when these very large birds, when they fly, they push their legs together to become more aerodynamic. And certainly from that distance, it could look like a tail. So, I think that I probably saw what some of the people that have different misidentifications of these, Thunderbirds, and sometimes false reports of just known species that look quite unusual in a certain circumstance.
Well, yeah, you had a question?
Well, I was going to say, I'm looking at talking about legends, I'm looking at a Mayan legend of a giant bird called the Tapajara. And it shows, a website shows a picture of a sculpture made by the Mayans of this half-man, half-bird creature that they called the Tapajara. And it was supposedly, they had eyewitness reports of it. And I was going to ask if you were familiar with that legend, Mr. Gerhard.
Well, of course, that's the third branch of the Thunderbird categories we were talking about earlier. You have the large raptor birds, you have the pterodactyl or pterosaurs, and then you also have what we call the flying humanoids. And, there aren't nearly as many of these types of reports, but they're very unusual nonetheless. And I did an episode of Monster Quest about a year ago called Terror from the Skies, and we actually went down to Mexico and investigated flying hominids and winged, anthropomorphic winged beings with human and avian features. There are a lot of legends throughout Mexico. The Maya have that one, of course. There's also Camazotz, the death bat. There's a legend of a birdman in and around the mountains of Monterey. And here in North America, you have things like Mothman. And in England, they have the Owlman. So you have these. They're certainly very rare, but we also do have these reports of basically what look like, man-sized creatures with humanoid features standing about 6 feet tall, but also with wings. And when we get into this stuff, then we're really getting onto the fringe of cryptozoology, because, these are considered, things from what we call the goblin universe. Not really scientifically viable creatures, but something else maybe.
Well,
right now,
since we're on this subject...
Oh, go ahead, Nick.
Oh, I was going to say, since we're on the subject, Mr. Gerhard, are you familiar with the Jersey Devil?
Well, of course, the Jersey Devil is very famous. It's one of the most kind of up there, perhaps even above Mothman as far as notoriety. It's generally considered to be a flying monster that's been reported, in the Pine Barrens and southern parts of New Jersey for, a century now, and perhaps even farther. And there's a famous legend there that has to do with witchcraft and a family known as the Leeds family, and a 13th child, and it gets kind of really weird and freaky. But there were a number of reports back in 1908, I believe, where people were describing something that had bat-like wings and a body like a horse, flying around and across rooftops, and it made a number of newspapers, and that's the general impression that we have of the Jersey Devil, and it's become kind of a iconic cultural thing up in New Jersey. Of course, they have a hockey team named after it and everything, so it's quite popular. As far as modern sightings and reports, I don't think there's necessarily a lot to it.
Oh, because I was going to say, one debate that we sometimes that we get into debates with people. Do you think, say, the Jersey Devil, whatever it may be, do you think it could be related to the Mothman or the Owlman in some type of way?
Well, I think all of those things could be related in some way that we just don't understand. And moreover, could be related to other reports of impossible creatures that, like the lizard man, werewolves, and some of these things that are just really, don't make any scientific or zoological sense, anthropomorphic beings. Whether they're related to extraterrestrials or paranormal activity or, who knows? I mean, that's kind of stuff that's really beyond our ken and our ability to understand. That's kind of the way I look at it. But we do investigate these reports because, in some cases we feel that people could be misidentifying known species of animals and giving them attributes or characteristics that are not necessarily accurate. And this is understandable because when people have these encounters, it's the emotions and the adrenaline pumping, and of course, it becomes a very traumatic experience, and people unfortunately have slightly false recollections of what they actually saw.
Definitely.
Well, I was just wondering real quick is, there's a lot of people talking about your chupacabra studies right now, actually. I know it says that's off topic, but yeah, I'll just email you in a second. But anyways, I was going to say check your emails. But speaking of the raptor-like birds, is there any sightings of them catching any sort of prey or anything like that?
Well, there's a very famous report known as the Lawndale incident that happened back in 1977, in July of 77, when a young boy named Marlon Lowe, who was playing in his backyard in Lawndale, Illinois, was picked up by one of two very large birds in front of his mother and some other neighbors and carried a fair distance before he was able to fight his way out loose and get released. And so many people eyewitnessed this. It was a very famous, it was quickly dismissed by the law enforcement and wildlife officials as being a turkey vulture or some known species, but turkey vultures and other known birds are not capable of picking up and grasping something, that weighs 60 pounds like a child. So that's really the most famous incident that involves a possible attack on a human. There is one here in Texas. A gentleman named Armando Grimaldo in Raymondville, Texas, was sitting on his porch one night when he claims a bat-like creature came down from the sky and ripped at his clothes and attacked him, and he was actually rushed to the hospital and was in shock. And there's also a report, you guys just reminded me, a report from a town called San Benito where an old woman was attacked one night while going out to her outhouse. So there are reports documented of attacks on humans, but, they're pretty rare. And I think if they did attack humans on a regular basis, we would certainly know more about them.
Well, another question that people are asking right now in our chat rooms, they're asking, do these birds make any kind of strange noises at all? Like, is there ever any reports of sounds?
Really, I don't have any. I think I may only have one or two reports of sounds, and typically it's kind of a squawk, that you would expect from a hawk or that type of bird. But no, that's something that really doesn't come up very often. We don't hear about that too much.
Yeah, I just sent you a quick email. So anyway, go ahead, Nick.
I was on your blog, Mr. Gerhard, and I was looking at that you were doing some work with that alleged chupacabra body found in Texas when we were just talking about that, I was going to interject really quickly. Did you get a chance to be able to see it and touch it yourself, or how familiar are you with that episode of that chupacabra photo and the body that it was discovered?
Well, first I should clarify that there have actually been about a dozen bodies that have been recovered over the past 4 years. Only a couple have really gotten a lot of media attention on a national level, but most of them have gotten some media attention. But the one that most people are familiar with turned up in Blanco, Texas a few months ago, and that was actually an animal that was found in a barn in Rosenberg. It was found dead and taken to a taxidermist there. That was the most recent one that really gained a lot of notoriety. Back in 2007, there was a woman named Phyllis Canyon who actually found a so-called chupacabra and cut off its head, and she was, parts of the head were examined by myself and others and tested for DNA and so forth. So there are some chupacabra remains floating around. We've got some up at Lubbock right now at Texas Tech that were found for a National Geographic special that we did earlier this year. So there are a number of these animals now. It's still a mystery to some extent, but we do have enough, evidence to kind of narrow it down and say that they're obviously canids or dogs. They have some type of bizarre skin condition and other deformities, and that's really the mysterious part now. Is why are these animals coming with these really strange deformities, this weird skin, and why are they behaving like they do? They definitely don't behave like the other wild dogs, for example, coyotes and so forth.
Yeah, I was reading on your blog that somebody said that maybe they should look into maybe some type of nuclear radiation pollution that might be causing this. In your opinion, is that a viable theory to maybe explain this phenomenon?
Unfortunately, I think that pollution or some type of ecological catastrophe could be at the root of this, and I think that's pretty significant for us as human beings, because if they're drinking or eating or being exposed to something that's making them look like this, then we could be at risk too, and I think that's kind of a big red flag and wake-up call for all of us.
Definitely.
A lot of it would be speculation, but in at least a couple of the cases we've found there could be a correlation to some type of pollution. So it's kind of a very sad statement. And it really reminds me of the incident about a decade ago. You guys might remember when there were a lot of amphibians and frogs that were being found with weird deformities, missing legs and extra legs and stuff. And that, that's kind of the same thing. So, sadly, it's, I think, a sign of the times and the man's impact on the environment.
Well, right now, we actually got some questions coming in. Speaking back on the topic of Thunderbirds, do these creatures make nests? Have there ever been any sort of homes of these creatures made? Like, have they ever been found?
No. They've none been found. There are a couple of vague, again, old reports of mountain climbers finding large nests, but nothing that's ever been verified or actually discovered and documented. Nor have there been large eggs found, which I think would be pretty cool. Sadly, there's not a lot of physical evidence, if any physical evidence, for Thunderbirds. We have one piece of footage that was filmed in Illinois back in 1977 that shows two very large birds flying over some trees. That piece of film is in dispute. Most scientists think that they're known birds like turkey vultures, but they do seem, to me personally, much, much larger than any North American bird except perhaps a condor. But other than that, unfortunately, we just don't have any evidence on the Thunderbirds. It's all circumstantial, a lot of eyewitness reports.
Well, right now also, speaking on the same topic of finding these nests, where would you, if you were to go looking for one of these creatures or a nest, where would you personally go to find one? Like if you could choose anywhere in the United States, where would you go to find one of these?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, if you could broaden that a little bit to North America, I think I'm very interested in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico. That's where I did some investigation there for the Monster Quest Terror from the Skies episode last year. It's one of the most unexplored areas in North America. I mean, you have this vast mountain range, millions of square miles, very uninhabited land and very high craggy peaks. And to me, that would explain why there's so many reports in South Texas, because obviously these big birds could be migrating periodically or moving through the area. But there's a population density, it seems, in both Pennsylvania, where there are a lot of Thunderbird reports, particularly in northern Pennsylvania, and also in parts of central Illinois. So I think I would also be interested in investigating perhaps the Ozark mountain ranges and some of the mountain ranges in Pennsylvania and in the Midwest. But there's really not one specific area that I'm necessarily focused on right now.
Well, right now I was actually thinking of something to go along with that. Is there any specific hotspots for either kind of these? For either the reptile-like or the raptor-like animals?
Well, as far as the reptile type, the pterosaurs, obviously New Guinea and Central Africa. As far as the North American Thunderbirds, again, I would say I actually have a giant map on my wall right now with all the Thunderbird reports that have been gathered throughout North America, and you can definitely see a concentration in the Midwest, ranging from Illinois, stretching across Indiana, Ohio, West Virginia, and up to Pennsylvania. So that seems to be where most of the reports occur, although over the last year I've received a number of reports from the Rocky Mountain area and extending up into the Pacific Northwest. And I don't know if that's because we're starting to encroach more and more on that terrain up there in some of these remote mountainous areas, and maybe that's why we're getting more reports. That would explain why there have been so many reports from the Midwest, just because of the population density. If there could be, if there are possibly some of these big birds in that area, they would be seen more often.
Well, speaking of the condor-like birds or the raptor-like birds, what types of birds are generally seen? Like, are they one or two specific types, or are they, like you said, are they mainly condors or eagles, or what would you say?
I think the vast majority, people are describing vulture-looking birds, something that resembles a condor. And that's why the best theory, or the most popular theory to explain Thunderbirds, are the teratorns. Not pterosaurs, but the teratorns were a species of bird several species of birds that lived throughout North America up through the Ice Age. And they had a very large wingspan. Some North American species had wingspans of about 18 feet across, and one in South America in particular had a 24-foot wingspan. And these teratorns were the ancestors to modern vultures and condors. So they probably resembled or closely resembled, our modern vultures. A lot of the reports that I've collected from the Rocky Mountains, people are describing generally something that looks more like an eagle, a very, very large eagle with a 14-foot wingspan. And typically they describe it as having sort of a reddish or bronze coloration, sort of like a golden eagle, which is a known species.
Well, speaking of these, is there any sort of reports that you've heard of? I know I asked a similar question earlier, but is there any similar reports of them eating anything or any sort of young creatures?
Any sort of what types of creatures? I'm sorry.
I was going to say, for any kind of them, is there any sort of an idea of what they eat, or any sort of reports of them feeding young ones or anything like that?
No, not that I'm aware of. If we think about or consider the teratorns, from what we know of their anatomy, they were probably scavengers. They didn't really have strong grasping claws. In fact, vultures and condors, even though they're very large birds, do not have very strong grasping claws. They're more like the feet of turkeys. Eagles, on the other hand, have very sharp talons and very strong grasping claws. So, we don't think that these animals are necessarily predatory creatures. And again, I think if they were predatory creatures, we'd be getting a lot more reports from humans who were being attacked. So I would assume they're probably scavengers. or perhaps, fish eaters, which a number of birds, will feed on smaller animals like rabbits, foxes, and also on fish.
Yeah. Well, on the reptile birds. Oh, you go ahead, Nick.
Oh, well, Mr. Gerhard, are you? We were talking about Pennsylvania earlier being a hotspot for activity. Do you know of any reports that have come out of the Black Forest region of Pennsylvania?
Oh, yeah, that's definitely one of the hot spots. Black Forest region, the Susquehanna River. I believe there's a town up there named Cowder's Point. There have been a lot of reports from around there. That is an area that I'd be very interested in exploring. I know there's a researcher named John Frick. He and his brother have spent a lot of time up there looking around, and that area I think has a lot of promise.
Well, what I was going to say was, speaking of the reptile-like birds, do you think that these are dinosaurs, or would you say that they're their own type of recent modern-day species?
Well, I mean, that's a good point. We have to really consider evolution, I think, is a pretty viable theory that most of us accept now. Adaptation and evolution. And we know for a fact from fossil records that these pterosaurs lived up until about 64 million years ago, but then there's a gap. There's no fossil discoveries of pterosaurs since that time. But 64 million years is a long time, and a lot of changes have occurred over the face of the planet in that time. So if there are pterosaurs in modern times, they've definitely evolved or adapted over that time period to suit the conditions of whatever niche they're in now. And they would certainly be survivors. And now it's not uncalled for, as you mentioned earlier. There have been species that have been rediscovered, like the coelacanth fish, which was considered to be extinct for millions of years. But of course, that was under the ocean, and not as impacted as the surface of the planet by different changes that have gone on over that time period. So yeah, I would say if there are, to answer the question, if there are pterosaurs around now, they're something different than what we know from the fossil record, but they look similar in some respect.
Well, would you say that these creatures, a question that was coming up in our chat room, would you say that there's any sort of color variation within the certain regions of the world that they're seen in?
Oh, color variations. Interesting question. I know in the African Kongamato, most people describe it as having a reddish color. As far as the ropan, I'm not really 100% sure what people have described. As far as color goes, probably tan or reddish color. But most of the thunderbirds that are reported in North America, people have described as being black or very dark. Typically black. That's the most common color by far that's described. Black feathers, completely feathered. But as I mentioned a moment ago, in the western part of North America, more people have described thunderbirds that have a reddish or bronze color.
Well, so, for instance, this picked North America. So are the creatures that are being seen in Mexico, are those similar or the same, like in descriptions, as the ones that are seen on, say, Pennsylvania or somewhere like that?
No, not at all. I think people in Mexico are really describing very unconventional types of things. We were discussing the flying humanoid types of creatures. There's a report about from a police officer who claimed he was attacked by a witch back in Monterey back in 2004. That was kind of a weird report. Of course, I haven't done as much investigation in Mexico. And being that you have in those areas of northern Mexico, you probably have a lot of isolation in small towns, and so these types of reports may be occurring on a regular basis, but perhaps people are not going public with them. And you guys can certainly relate, I'm sure, in your research, because there's a heavy ridicule factor that's associated with all of these types of encounters, whether it be Bigfoot or the chupacabra or giant birds. When people come forward with these reports, generally they're ridiculed and not believed because these are really fascinating and extraordinary claims. So that, I personally believe that there's a lot more reports, or a lot of reports that we may never find out about, and that people are suppressing for those reasons. So it's just a very small percentage that actually makes it into the hands of researchers and get the attention they deserve.
Well, since we're here on the last about 10 minutes or so of the show, Mr. Gerhard, would you mind maybe just giving us a little bit of information about your book, Big Bird, Modern Sightings of Flying Monsters?
Yeah. Thanks for giving me the plug. Big Bird, Modern Sightings of Flying Monsters is the book I published back in 2007. It's available online for most major book retailers like Amazon and Barnes & Noble and so forth. It's not a huge book. I mean, it has as much information as I could cram in there. It's mostly deals with the Texas reports, but I do discuss the global reports of Thunderbirds from Pennsylvania and New Guinea and all over the world. Anyone that's interested in flying cryptids or flying monsters, I would encourage you to check it out. I'd also like to add that I have a new book coming out in 2 weeks. It was co-written with Nick Redfern, who some of your listeners may be familiar with.
Yeah, he was on here about a month ago.
Yeah, he's an excellent researcher. Well, Nick lives here in Texas, and he and I are good friends, so we decided to write a book called The Monsters of Texas. And it's going to cover a wide variety of different monster reports, including I've got a follow-up chapter on Big Bird, which includes a lot of new reports that I've collected since the book came out. We do chapters on Bigfoot, the Texas version of the Chupacabra, werewolves in Texas, the Goatman, lake monsters, and it goes on and on. So we really, Texas is a big state, and we really had a lot of good material here to go through. And between Nick and I, we investigate a lot of these different cryptids. So that's the Monsters of Texas, and that'll be out in about 2 weeks. And that'll have, as I mentioned, a good amount of Big Bird material as well.
Well, another thing that I was thinking, because there's a couple minutes left in the show, so do you have any current investigations or current projects?
Oh, wow. Well, I'm always working on stuff. I probably have too many projects going on right now. Just to go back to the Texas Chupacabra for a second, and of course Chupacabra is kind of a glorified name that the media has adopted because it gets a lot of attention and excitement. As many of you listeners are probably aware, there's a huge difference in variation between the Texas Chupacabra and the one that was reported in Puerto Rico back in the 1990s, which looked more like a goblin. The Texas creatures we know are canids, dogs. We've proven that now with several DNA tests and also, just being able to study the remains. But they look very strange. But there's still a mystery there, and we're actually referring to these animals now as the Texas blue dogs because they seem to have a strange blue coloration to their hairless skin. And I'm still involved and have been involved with National Geographic and now the Center for Fortean Zoology to really try to put a conclusive answer to this mystery of why these canids or dogs look like this and why they're starting to really proliferate and pop up all over the state, much more in recent months. And we've gotten a lot of reports that have started popping up everywhere. So they're definitely breeding and passing on these traits or disease or whatever it is. So I'm really working on that right now. And I've got some cool television projects in the works too. So I can't really give up too much information on that, but hopefully people will stay tuned to some of the cable channels and look out for some cool cryptozoology shows that will be coming up.
Well, we also have a question that was coming out for a while now from multiple people. Is there anywhere you're doing any appearances or any sort of lectures, or where could our audience find you if they wanted to look up more information on you?
Well, if anyone wants to meet me in person, the weekend after next, I'll be lecturing at the Haunted Retreat in Tennessee, and this is an event in South Pittsburgh, Tennessee, which is it's a really cool location. It's a haunted hospital down there that has a lot of activity, and I'll be doing a lecture along with Jody Cook, who's one of the top Bigfoot researchers from Ohio. So that's my next public appearance. And I have a lot of other prospective lectures on the horizon in the next few months. So I'll be popping up at a lot of ghost conferences around the country. And even though what I do isn't necessarily related to ghosts per se, of course, I find all that stuff very interesting, and I think people that are interested in any type of unexplained phenomenon, are generally interested in the others as well. So I think it's kind of a nice, refreshing thing when people go to these ghost conferences and we can talk about cryptozoology for an hour or so.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have about 5 minutes left in the show. Right now, we're getting a ton of questions on your chupacabra studies, actually, which is kind of ironic. I was going to say, have you ever read any books on the chupacabra?
Well, I did a chapter for my new book that's coming out, Monsters of Texas. We did a really extensive chapter on that. It's probably the longest chapter in the book, and because we had so much material to deal with as far as bodies that have been found and reports and so forth. So I've never written a book specifically dedicated to that. But who knows? Maybe that'll be coming in the future.
Well, I was going to say, Nick, do you have any other questions?
No, I'm I run high and dry out of good questions. We went through a lot of information tonight, more than I thought we would.
Oh, well, there's another question. One last question.
Yeah.
Sorry. Somebody keeps telling me, what's your hat story they keep asking me about?
I think I know who that is. It's kind of like an inside joke. I have a hat that most people that have seen me on TV probably recognize. It's a sort of a leather cowboy hat with a big skull, silver skull on the front. And the story behind my hat is that it's my trademark. And I bought it a few years ago, actually, well, several years ago up in Toronto at a biker clothing store. And I just thought it was a really cool hat and just started wearing it all the time. And it's just kind of stuck. It's a look that I've kept. Most people will typically recognize the hat wherever I go, even if they don't know who I am. Hey, I know that hat. So it's kind of infamous at this point. What's kind of funny about that is that my most recent special, or one of my most recent specials, which was The Real Wolfman, which was on the History Channel back here in February, they wouldn't let me wear the hat for the TV show. The producers and some of the people at the History Network just thought it was a little bit over the top. They were trying to, I guess, appeal to a pretty broad audience, and they, were discussing whether it might affect my credibility and so forth. So I kind of buckled and caved into pressure there, and I ditched the hat for that particular episode. But the hat is part of who I am, and it's, as far as I'm concerned, I'm going to wear it until someone rips it off.
Well, also, do you research Bigfoot still?
I do, yeah, absolutely. In fact, there was a pretty notable report here in San Antonio, about 12 miles from where I live, back in November. There was a 9/11 call that police received from a couple that claimed they saw Bigfoot walk out of the woods and pick up a dead deer and run off with it. It made the news here. It was kind of a big deal. We were out there for about a week or two investigating the area. Didn't really turn up any evidence, one kind of ambiguous-looking track. I'm planning several Bigfoot expeditions this year, though. I'm in the process of working on some things in Oklahoma, Ohio, possibly Florida for the skunk ape. I love doing work down there, so I'm always on the track of Bigfoot, the big hairy fellow. It's a fascinating mystery, and I had the great privilege of working with a lot of really awesome researchers, some of the top people.
Have you ever worked with Mike Green?
Mike Green? You mean Bill Green?
Wait, Mike Green, Gerhard, was the guest we had on last week, was it? 2 weeks ago?
Yeah.
No, I'm afraid I know of him, but no, I don't know him personally.
Oh, okay.
Well, we have about a minute left in the show. I was just going to see if you wanted to post any links or say anything where people can find you, or any books or anything like that.
Well, yeah, people are welcome to check me out. I have kengerhard.com, which is my cryptozoology blog site. And in fact, later tonight, I'm going to post a story about the Bunny Man, since it's Easter. And I think it's a great thing that people will be interested in. So if anyone wants to check out kengerhard.com. And, of course, you can also find me on Facebook and MySpace. So anyone that has a report they'd like to give me, in confidence, or just want to ask me a question or whatever, feel free to get in touch.
Well, again, thanks for doing the interview with us, Ken.
Yes, thank you.
Jeremy, Nick, thanks for having me. I had a blast. Let's do it
All right, I
again
sent
sometime.
you an email to you. There are 2 emails.
All right. Very cool. Well, here's wishing everyone out there a great Easter, or what's left of it.
Yeah,
happy Easter, everybody. Yeah, thanks for listening.